In today's video, I'm going to show you how to remove a transmission and transfer case from a 1997 Dodge Dakota with a 5.2 liter engine with a 5-speed transmission. As you can see, I already have the shifter removed from the top of the transmission. If you want to know how to get this taken out of here, look up my other video and I'll have the link in the description that shows how to get this part done. So here's my wannabe assistant. His name's Hank. This is a pretty nice cat. Seems like no matter where you are outside, this cat has to be always right where you are, so don't be surprised if you see him coming in and out of the videos. So first thing I'm going to have to do is remove this rear drive line. It's held in by 4 small bolts. They only have a 3/8 inch head on them. Seems like an awful weak setup for being a half-ton truck, but I guess the engineers knew what they were doing when they made this choice. Once I get these 4 bolts undone, it'll be a pretty easy removal. Just push forward a little bit. Get that slip joint. Let's see if I can get the camera here where you can actually see it. Yep, there it is. See the big ring? Anyways, once I get that rear taken off, I just drop it, pull back on this, comes out of the transfer case. So I now have the driveline removed, and as you can see, I put the brackets and bolts back into the yoke. I do this wherever possible. It just helps me to keep from losing the different parts. And check up here. You can see it came out of the back of the transfer case with no problem. Lost a little bit of fluid. That's not going to be a big deal. Probably going to end up putting fresh fluid in it before we're done anyways. So the next piece I'm going to have to remove is a skid plate that is directly under the transfer case. This truck has a 6-inch lift on it, and I don't know if this plate is a stock piece or if it's something that was added later on as part of the lift kit. But either way, there's 4 5/8 head bolts. Just got to take them out and get this out of the way. So now that the skid plate is out of the way, it's time to remove the front drive line. It's even crazier up here. Both ends are bolted on right here at the transfer case, and then again up here at the front differential. And the crazy part, these bolts are even smaller. They only have a 5/16 head on them. So I'm going to pull all 8 bolts and get this thing out of here. This is day 2 of the Dodge Dakota clutch replacement. The other night I had to shut down a little bit early. I had trouble with these particular bolts. This is a front drive line with the end that bolts onto the transfer case. And the problem that I was having is that when I was using, let's see if you can see it there, the 5/16 ratchet with the 12-point socket, it was just trying to strip out the bolts rather than bringing them loose, which you can see right here, there's a little bit of galling on it. So I decided, well, maybe I'd better try an 8mm on it. 8mm, 5/16, they're so close in size, most of the time you can interchange with the wrenches and it doesn't really matter. Well, my 8mm wrench was also a 12-point, and it was having the same problem, so I had to shut it down for the night. The next morning, I went down to one of our second-hand shops and looked through the tool section, and I located this 8mm 6-point. Now, a 6-point, it doesn't give you quite as many options for an angle when you go to put it on, so you can take off your bolts, but it has 100% grip all the way around, so every once in a while you might run into this problem, and it's better to go with a 6-point than a 12-point. The next thing to remove are these track bars that are part of the front suspension. Again, I don't know if this is something that comes stock on the truck or if it's just part of the 6-inch lift. But Either way, they got to come out of here. Looks like it's going to take, what is it, 4 bolts that are 3/4 inch. Okay, now for the part that I always dread. I got to drop the exhaust off of the manifolds. And I swear, every time I got to do this, I always break at least 1 bolt. Doesn't matter if I use PB Blaster on it, or if I use an impact gun, or just try and ease it off with a socket wrench. These buggers just always seem to have a habit of busting one of them if the vehicle has any age to it at all. So you can see each side. I don't know if I can get up here to see this or not. Yeah, just barely. But all 4 of those got to come off. And then this joint here has to come undone. And right there is a wire. It goes up to a plug. I know I can pull that plug down out of there and get it disconnected pretty easy. Okay, so I got a little bit ahead of myself. I just removed the slave cylinder for the clutch mechanism. There's just 1 bolt right there, as you can see. And then there's another bolt. Yeah. Probably can't really get up there to see it on the top, but, you know, there's a 2nd bolt just right up in there. Once you get those 2 bolts undone, you just slide it backwards and then move it down out of your way. Yeah. So then you're just left with that. And you can go ahead and just let this piece hang here. Okay, I just put a brace in place up against the tail shaft of the transfer case. This is to hold the whole setup in place while I take out this entire cross member. It's kind of hard to see this close up. But it has 4 bolts on each side of the frame. Well, let me get my light up here. So on each side of this cross frame, you got a bolt right here at the bottom, bolt up at the top. You get over here to the other side, pretty much got the same thing. And then again, I think these parts here are more of the added suspension. This crossbar has to come off. See the 2 slots there? Right up inside those slots. See if I can get a good angle on this. Yeah, there you go. You can see 2 of the 4 bolts in there that go to the mount for the transmission. Those have to come loose as well, and then this whole cross member will come out. I just discovered that there's a fuel line bracket on the driver's side of the cross member, and you need a 1/2 inch wrench in order to remove this. There's actually plenty of room up in here, so I'm just going to reach up there with the wrench and get that thing out, and then I'll take the rest of these bolts out and remove the cross member. Well, I'm in a bit of a bind here. I've got all the bolts on the cross member undone, but it just does not want to come out of here. I think what has happened, this frame has gotten tweaked, and the way that this thing bolts into there, it's made it so that the bottom of the frame is a little closer together than the top. And so this thing is just mechanically, jammed in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out this mount on the bottom of the transmission. And then I'm going to use a scissors jack between the transmission and the cross member and try and press it out of place. Now that the cross member's out of the way, I have to disconnect this linkage for the transfer case shift lever. And the way to do it, see if I can get this up in here. Pry it out with a screwdriver. Well, I think I'm going to have to use both hands for this. Didn't look like that was going to be real hard to take out, but I had to get a couple of big screwdrivers up in there and pry on both sides of that little rod. But once you get it out of there, you can just pull that down and out of your way. At this stage, we're going to have to unplug a few electrical wires. Looks like there's 3 of them that are going to the transfer case. There's one right there. And then you got a couple of more. See if I can get an angle on that. Yeah, right there in the center of the screen. You can see there's a gray one right up on top. And then a black plug that's just to this side of it. And then up here on the side of the transmission. Yeah, right there in the center of the shot again. It's another plug that has to come undone. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and remove this shifter mechanism for the transfer case. Looks like it just takes these 2 bolts in here that are 5/8. And having that off, it'll just be one less thing to get hung up on while I'm trying to pull the transmission and reinstall it. So I got another correction here. These bolts that were holding on the shifter for the transfer case, they're not 5/16, they're actually 16 millimeter. It's been a little bit of frustrating on this vehicle. Seems like about a third of the bolts and nuts on this thing are metric while the rest are standard. They must have had an American and a Canadian both working on the design team. Okay, I can pull the starter out now. There is a 16 millimeter bolt on the bottom side of the starter. And then I know I ain't going to be able to get the camera up above, but there's a second one right up there on top. It should be pretty easy to pull. I've got a little bit of extra suspension parts right here that are from that 6-inch lift. I thought I was going to have to pull them, but it doesn't look like they're really going to be in the way. Okay, I can go ahead and start pulling the transfer case now. I still have the jack stand hooked onto the back end of the transfer case. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen up the 3 bolts that are here on the driver's side of the transfer case. I'm going to get them loosened up and removed, and then I'm going to bring my transmission jack in here, and I'll put it under the transfer case, and I'll go around to the other side, and I'll take out the other 3 bolts, and then I'll wiggle everything loose and bring it on down out of there, so it'll be less weight to deal with when I pull the whole transmission. So this is a good example of what cheap Chinese tools are good for. I had to cut this wrench in half so that I would have one that was short enough I could reach in and get the top nuts that are, holding the transfer case onto the transmission. I've always thought it was a good idea. Whenever you're at garage sales, just look for cheap extra tools. Sometimes you can get a whole toolbox just dirt cheap. Keep these things around. You just never know what you might have to modify in order to be able to get that one bolt that's keeping you from completing a job. Now, in order to get this, I'm just going to throw another wrench onto the end of this stub, and I'll just use it as leverage to pop this thing loose, and then I should be able to get it the rest of the way just using my fingers. Worked like a charm. Well, that transfer case came out a lot easier than I thought it would. Apparently it's an all aluminum case, so it didn't hardly weigh anything, and all I did was just unbolted it, slid it back, and just slowly rolled it down off the jack. Wasn't a big deal at all, but once I got it out of there, I discovered this hose coming down to it. So I'll just get on this little clamp with a pair of pliers, and I'll undo that, and the transfer case will come out from under the truck. So now my transmission jack is fully supporting the transmission, and you can see here I have a tie-down strap that goes all the way up around the transmission to the other side, ratchet it down pretty tight. That way, you know, it's strapped down good and tight and it's not going to come off this jack. And I've also put the scissor jack up here between the bottom rail on the front suspension, and then it goes up here against this piece of 2x4 which is up against the oil pan. That's going to keep the motor from dropping when I pull the transmission off. Well, this is a first. I'm beginning to take the bell housing bolts out. You can see the one bolt right there. It's a 5/8, so I believe that means that all the other bolts around it are going to be 5/8. But I cannot get to the bolt that's just above it without taking off this oil filter. I've never seen that on a vehicle before. Apparently I haven't worked on enough Dodges. So here's the next pain in the butt part of the process. I got to get the bell housing bolts off the top of the bell housing. Over on the other side, I've already got them off, but you can't see them. You got to reach in behind there and just go by feel using a 9/16 wrench. There's one just a little bit to the side of being top, and then one a further bit down. Over on this side, I got to remove this little reservoir here, and possibly, I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's a little plug-in right here that kind of gets in the way of my arm. I'm going to get those off and see if there's anything else that has to come out in order for me able to get my arm down in there to get those last two bolts. Well, I got the transmission down and out of the way. Now comes the fun part of getting this pressure plate off. I can get to the bolts easy enough, but honestly, I don't have a whole lot of room in here between the transmission and the engine, you know, to reach up in there and get a hold of that thing. But I'll do my best and get that thing out of there. Now this is what you'd call a blown clutch. You can see where all the pieces are pretty much disintegrated. Most of it's gone. This is what happens when you're trying to pull too heavy of a load up a steep hill and you end up dumping the clutch a couple of times trying to get it to go. It's not good at all. Normally this flywheel would get pulled off and resurfaced in between clutch changes, but I know personally that this clutch only had 10 to 15,000 miles on it. I've gone over the flywheel. I can't find any grooves or obvious wear. The only thing that's really out of the ordinary is just this little bit of glazing from when the clutch heated up. It's not going to hurt at all to reuse this as is. The one thing that I will do, I'm going to take some sandpaper. I'm going to break this glaze just to, you know, give it a nice good surface again.